Hi everybody, this is Jack from Rambling Raconteur, and I finished 310 to Yuma and Other Stories by Elmore Leonard, slim 200-page book, 7 short stories, all of them good, some of them absolutely stellar. And what I had been doing was reading one a night for the past week, and so that was how I worked through these. They were a perfect way to sort of like relax after after the day, and sort of jumpstart my reading. I was using these as kind of the spark plug to get going. I would read a story, usually about 20 pages, and then that would lead me into reading something else, something that might be longer or require a different level of attention. So 310 to Human Other Stories, very good little volume. There are other collections of his short stories. There are at least 2 more that Harper Torch did that are real slim ones like this. Of course, there's the complete Western stories of Elmore Leonard, which I don't have in my house right now, and I'm not going to have with social distancing going on. I'm not going to reobtain that one from my friend anytime soon. And I believe Library of America, in his Westerns volume they had a number of his short stories as well. I don't own that one, so I'm not sure. But he's a good writer. He initially wrote westerns for a solid 15 years before he I don't want to say graduated, because graduated implies that westerns are somehow inferior to crime novels, and that's not accurate. But he shifted from writing primarily westerns to writing primarily crime novels. Library of America does a great series. This is his 1970s volume. And each one, I believe, they have one for the 70s, one for the 80s, one for the 90s. Each one has 4 books. This has 52 Pickup, Swag, Unknown Man number 89, and The Switch. And his crime novels were very successful. He's a very successful writer, well-known writer. He continued writing into the 2000s. And one of the interesting aspects of Leonard is he was always getting adaptations from his stories or his novels. 310 to Yuma famously was adapted more than once. Once with Glenn Ford as sort of the bad guy, and I think it's Van Heflin. I think he's the dad from Shane. Someone who's taking him to the state or the territorial prison in Yuma. Arizona's not a state at the time. And then there was the one maybe 10 years ago with Russell Crowe as the villain and Christian Bale as the guy who's got to get him on the train to the territorial prison in Yuma. But so in the 50s, right out of the gate, Elmore Leonard was having stories adapted, and all the way through, he continued to have different works of his adapted into films, some very successful, some less successful. For me, I think the first adaptation of his that I actually saw was the Justified TV series, which I really enjoyed, and that had come off of 2 novels he had written about a U.S. Marshal, who sort of had a Western style, almost gunslinger style, but was a U.S. Marshal in the South. So, a couple of notes on Leonard real fast. One is that his Western stories read very much like his crime novels. Bad guys are bad guys. Good people are good people. His characters are not shattering you with surprises. He sketches them very quickly, very well, and they're fairly consistent. He's definitely more on the Charles Dickens side of character than on the Euripides side of character, where his characters are sharply drawn, they're well drawn, and what you see is what you get. It puts an emphasis on his writing, it puts an emphasis on the action and plot. It does not put an emphasis on character psychology, or we're not necessarily looking for huge growth from characters. We're often, in the stories we're given 20 pages, quick vignette episodes of what life would be like for this type of character. He has a real sense of what the desert looks like in southern Arizona. So famously, at the top of Arizona, you have the high Colorado Plateau, you have the Colorado River cutting through it, so we get the Grand Canyon, Horseshoe Bend, absolutely gorgeous. You move farther south and you run into some around Flagstaff, there's pine trees, there's huge forests, forests you would expect for a forest anywhere else in the U.S. to be. As you move south, there's the Mogollon Rim, and the Verde Valley, and you see like there's this like stretch of green that cuts through, and that's when then you really get into like the desert of Arizona. And so the south central part of Arizona, you have the Sonoran Desert, and on the western side of Arizona, you have the Mojave Desert, which runs over into Joshua Tree National Park over in California, and very different like desert climates. And then farther south in the Sonoran Desert, you have these sections of mountains that are just strange. They are really weird looking. They're Dragoon Mountains. They don't look like what you normally think of as mountains. They look like a child got a hold of like Play-Doh, pieces of pink and white and like gray and yellow Play-Doh, and like tried to make mountains and then left it out to dry for a week in the heat, and it crystallized, and so you have these like bluff blocks, and he evokes that so well. So he's got characters who are miners or these like 2-bit, the one loop herds, and we're just given characters. None of the characters are particularly wealthy. There are violent criminals, but they're not belabored. It's just very clear. These are bad. These are dangerous people. Here it is. Here's what you get. Go forward. If there's any, like, I don't want to say knock, but anything that this book didn't have, there wasn't really much to do with Native Americans. The very first story was Cavalry Boots, I believe is what it was called, and it involved a U.S. cavalry troop, and they're ambushed by some Native Americans. One of them tries to flee. He runs into a ghost town, and then he's trying to figure out, is there a way to get out of those 3 buildings without getting killed? And that's the entire story. And that's almost the entire interaction around Native Americans. But I want to read a quick passage from Under the Friar's Ledge so you can get a sense of what his writing's like. They said he could have been the richest man in Mexico, but his only concern was for mezcal and a full bean pot to answer the growl in his belly. Spending any more than would have been wasteful. On one occasion, 2 men resentful of Juan's niggardly attitude followed him into the range when he left for his annual collection. One came back a month later, with his mind still in the hills. The other never returned. It was a long time before anyone tried it again. But that was when struggles entered the story. Or they were in high timbered country, moving their horses and pack mules single file along a trail that cut into the pines, climbing to distant rimrock. Where the slope leveled, they came out onto a bench that opened up for a dozen yards, revealing, down over the tops of the lower pines and dwarf oaks, the country they had left hours before. In the timber it was cool, but below, the sandy flats and the scattered rock eruptions were all the same glaring yellow, hazy through a dust that hung motionless. At first, Struggles thought he was seeing sunspots from the glare. He blinked before squinting again, and now he was certain there were no sunspots. Far off against the yellow glare, a confused number of moving specks were pointing toward the deep shadows of a barranca. Juan Solo was watching with the palm of his hand shading his eyes. He looked at the surgeon when the specks passed out of sight. Now there is no doubt, he said. Struggles' rough face turned to him quickly. Why, that could be anybody. Senor Doctor, Juan said quietly, this is my country. And it's just very great, like, we're ready, the action's going to start. But such evocative descriptions of the landscape. And what's really cool is Leonard didn't grow up in Arizona. I believe he spent I think he spent most of his formative youth in Detroit. And I don't know how often he ever visited Arizona. Apparently, he got so much of the geography of southern Arizona, and these are remote locations. Like, they've never been extraordinarily large locations. Tucson's the largest city in the southern part of Arizona, and Tucson's barely mentioned in these stories. Yuma, where the territorial prison is, in these stories, it is not a very large city now. So some of the places that he mentions here don't exist anymore. They ceased to exist in 1900. The post office was closed in 1891 or so, and then they just ceased to exist. You can go visit down there and you just see concrete foundations along little trails near the San Pedro River. But apparently Leonard figured out how to get all these landscapes by reading the Arizona Highways magazines, which would publish like stories of the Old West or little historical or cultural anthropology like stories on articles, and they'd have pictures, and so that was how he developed a great deal of his sort of like description and his ideas around these stories. Now the plots could easily be shifted to an urban landscape with dealing with with 1970s small time gangsters and middle class, lower middle class workers trying to get by, and then brought into sudden interaction with them. The plots are interchangeable, but he's a very evocative writer of that Western landscape in a way that doesn't necessarily make you think of like the John Ford just like grand vista. And he just stretches. Yeah, it stretches, but that's dangerous. It means that you might become dehydrated. You might not have enough water. You might get lost and not be able to walk back home if something bad happens. And that's kind of the sense you get, is that the desert, as beautiful as it is also can be a very dangerous place. So the stories in this collection were Cavalry Boots, which was okay. Under the Friar's Ledge was amazing. It involved, that was where I read the passages from that one. That involves a guy and two characters basically traveling out to where some secret mine was from 250 years ago, when the Spanish first came and were trying to create mines and colonies in northern Mexico. And it is very good. 310 to Yuma, which is a solid story. Long Night, where it's basically set just in a small shack where a couple of wounded, criminals were there, and there's a man and his wife interacting with them, trying to figure out how to get through the situation. The Captives, which is a longer story and feels like I don't think The Captives was ever filmed, but it would make a great film. Jugged, which is really just set in like a prison cell. With a 19-year-old cowhand who got in a fight with his friends at the local saloon when they came through, and he gets put in with the town bad man, and that's the entire story. And then The Kid, which was a really interesting story about a boy who had been adopted by a Mexican family after his parents died from a fever. A Native American tribe came through and captured him, and he was raised then with the Native Americans, and then he ends up kind of getting lost and found by this very abusive American cowboy, small-time rancher, and how their interaction goes, and how there are some couple of individuals who want to work with this boy and try and get him away and get him either back home or some better life. So that was 310 to Yuma and Other Stories by Elmore Leonard. I really highly recommend his Western writing if you've never read any of it. His novels are enjoyable. His stories are very fun, quick reads. Like I said, they were my entry into reading the past week. So thank you, everyone, and hope everybody's doing well. Bye.